Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my absolute privilege to be having this dialogue with our very special speakers today. The context for this has already been established. Under the Indian G20 presidency, the call of the Global South has been loud and clear. And that call is for countries from the South to be an equal partner in global decision making. And central to this is the inclusion and making space for Africa and the agenda of inclusive development with energy transition and climate action. I'm going to dive right in as we have a lot of ground to cover in this conversation. Mr. Kant, the Indian G20 promised one Earth, one family, and one future, and delivered on that with the inclusion of the African Union. Yet, we do live in very divided times. We see a hardening of states with the situation in the Middle East. And that, of course, has also impacted global energy security. How can we get out of our silos to look for effective solutions for the energy crisis? How do we keep Africa at the center of this conversation when the world is also distracted by global conflicts and global crises?
So the important thing is to build consensus on a number of developmental issues. G20 is essentially a forum for economic growth. It's a forum for development. It's not a political forum. But issues, when you have conflicts like Russia, Ukraine, or Israel conflict, it has a fallout on food, fuel, and fertilizer, and therefore, several G7 countries during Indonesia's presidency last year said that it has an implication on economic growth, and therefore the issue came up for discussion. But broadly, let me say that G20 is a forum not for politics, it's for economic growth and for developmental issues. And therefore, our view was very clear that India's presidency must be very inclusive, it must be very decisive, and it must be very action-oriented, and that's what we attempted throughout. And when we started off our presidency, the first thing the Prime Minister did was to have a meeting with 125 countries of the Global South, and he heard out all the leaders, and based on their requirements, the priorities of India's were based. So India's priorities were very clearly based on very strong, sustainable, inclusive growth. There were priorities of sustainable development goals as the world had regressed instead of moving ahead. And there were priorities of how to take greater climate action, and therefore we came up with a Green Development Pact. And there was a priority of technological development and advancement through digital public infrastructure. And of course, you need the multilateral development banks to restructure and realign themselves for a changed world. And lastly, the priority of women-led development. But one of our key achievements has been that we've made AU a permanent member of G20, and that was necessary because if you look at the demographics today, and if you look at the growth model today, 80% of the growth is coming from emerging markets. And according to IMF and World Bank, 2/3 of the growth in the next 2 decades are going to come from emerging markets. And today, 6 of the fastest growing 12 countries in the world are from Africa. So Global South is going to grow. And if global growth is going to take place, you have an aging population in Europe, you have demographically a very young population in Africa and in India, and by the sheer force of demographics, these countries are going to grow in. And therefore, my view is that the global North needs the global South, and you need to technologically transform these countries. You need to accelerate the pace of SDGs. You need to do energy transition much quicker and faster. These are countries which are vulnerable to climate change, and therefore you need to provide greater amount of financial flows to these countries, and therefore you need a restructuring of multilateral financial institutions. But let me assure you that India's presidency laid a lot of focus on both. It is one document, the New Delhi Leaders document is one document which is a living, breathing document which speaks the voice of the global South. I don't think multilateralism was brought back center stage, but global South really was the centerpiece of this document.
Mr. Flasberth, Samir, of course, had just talked about how what was initiated under the German presidency has, in a way, been propelled further by India. What are we really talking about when we talk about bringing Africa to the center of development and transition? And what are the realistic objectives that we can look at when we say this? Keeping in mind also that Africa will be and is a major resource of raw materials for the clean energy transition. How can we also ensure that that the partnerships that are built are not extractive but equal?
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for having me here. And what a pleasure, Amitabh, to be on a podium again. We were yesterday evening on a podium, so I could refer to everything we said yesterday, but as the audience is different, I just let me, at the very beginning, again, applaud Amitabh to the wonderful work India has done for G20 and through that for the world. Also on what you mentioned, the EU accession to the G20, which was one of the, there are many inequities in the world and unfair situations, but that was one of the most visible ones, that Africa was not a full member at the G20, sitting on the guest table. So we supported it, you made it, and we are very proud that we together made this possible. To your question, I think it's about Africa, but it's talking about Africa is also talking about how we work together in the world. And I want to make 3 points. It's about an ambitious compass we need. It's about pragmatism, and it's about dignity. We'll be very brief, no worries. On the ambitious compass, we have one, and that's the SDGs, the 2030 agenda. And again, I'm very happy that at the summit in New York, and also as a result of the G20 presidency and the leaders meeting, there is a clear commitment to the 2030 agenda. I can tell you it was at risk, because it's so easy for 1 or 2 leaders in the world just to say, look, friends, we were ambitious in 2015, but look where we are. It was a nice try, but we can't achieve it. But constantly I'm saying, this is nothing nice to have. It's about the reality of the people. And the Agenda 2030 compass is the right one. It's to overcome poverty and hunger, to overcome inequality, and allow for every person on this globe a decent life. That's what it is about. Now about pragmatism. I don't like the word or the phrase of a multipolar world. I prefer to speak about multi-alliances. And that is what we are seeing. G20 is one. You rightly said it, Amitabh. It's coming out of an economic and financial perspective. At the end, it is political, because we are speaking about obstacles standing in the way to organize economic growth and increasing welfare for the people. And then you are immediately in those extremely relevant political arenas. And the G20 is one group. The G7 is another one. Then we have regional groupings like the EU getting closer together. We have old alliances, and we have new ones like the BRICS. And what I want to say with, and the extended BRICS discussion, and there was a quite nervous debate in what we call the old Global West. What is happening there? Is that right? Do they have really a common agenda? Look, they have different views and values. I mean, are we serious? Look, 2, 3, 4 years back, did the G7 have joint values at that time? So we should be more pragmatic, look at all the opportunities to run as fast as ever possible to our 2030 agenda. And this is undoable without the African continent, as it is without Latin America, and with the introduction, the incoming presidency under President Lula in Brazil was mentioned. My last point is dignity. I think we should overcome times when some in the world were thinking snobbishly about having the right recipes for the world. It's about listening. It's about putting yourself in the right position. It's everybody, each country can deliver. But I think none of us can deliver alone. So put us in the right relationship, and then I think we can turn the world really to the better.
So when we talk about how every country can deliver, the question of finance has to come up. The G20 took up the idea of MDB reform in a big way to address the financing gap, especially in the context of just transitions, and with the worry that MDBs will not be able to mobilize enough money for developing countries. Are you optimistic about how much has been achieved in that?
Not at all optimistic about what has been achieved so far. In 2009, at Copenhagen, the developed world had committed to $100 billion. Other than Germany, nobody else has done very much, and we've not reached the $100 billion, which it said that will probably be achieved this year. But there are also other views that there has been a lot of greenwashing that has taken place. But the challenge is that to pre-2030 level, we've identified that you need about close to $5.9 trillion, and for clean energy, emerging markets themselves need about close to $4 trillion. So we must understand that this kind of money, this kind of resources can only be available if you don't, both for SDG and for climate action. They're both two sides of the same coin. And you need long-term lending and you need long-term resources. That's not possible from the existing structure of multilateral development banks, because these were constituted in post-World War II period, in the post-Bretton Woods period, when there was no crisis of climate action. There was no crisis of sustainable development goals to be achieved by 2030. You need long-term lending. These institutions all do direct lending. They don't do indirect lending at all. Let me also say that there's no shortage of funds in the world. There are $300 trillion available with private funds. Almost $150 trillion are available with sovereign wealth funds and with pension funds who want to lend, but who want to lend for climate action. All of them want to lend for climate action. But the challenge is that there are different risks. So the interest rates at which you get money in Germany is 2%, in United States is 2%, in India it's 8%, in Africa it's 16%, in sub-Saharan countries it's 22% because the risks are high. So you need to de-risk some of these projects, and you need instruments like blended finance, first loss guarantees, credit enhancements. These are instruments which are not being used. What is the extent of private financing being done by World Bank? 0.6% to a dollar. I mean, that means the inability to raise private resources by multilateral development institutions. And they should be doing 100x of that. And that is what this new report, N.K. Singh and Larry Summers' report talks about, that there is a need for greater ability to raise private resources. And there is a need to capacity enhance these multilateral development finance to be able to meet the requirements of these countries. It's also important to understand this, that, when we talk about climate action, that 1% of the private companies today account for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Now, the market doesn't punish them because there's no machine-readable data which is put out. Stock markets, it's not put out in a transparent manner before the stock exchanges. And if that data is available today in machine-readable formats, and people are aware that these are companies which are causing the greenhouse gas emissions, the markets will punish them. And that is very important in the long run, because long-term value creation and long-term your ability to get capital for further expansion should all be based on how green you are. And that is important. And secondly, to my mind, it's very important that all these institutions, multilateral development banks, must move towards indirect lending through completely new instruments. The instrument of Amiga in World Bank, for instance, needs to be tapped in much more, 100x more than what it does at present. It's a very powerful instrument, but it needs to be tapped much more. The important thing is that the international financial structure today is heavily weighed against the global south. The requirement is in global south, the growth is going to happen in global south, the demographics are in favor of global south, but the international financial architecture is weighed against it. Inflation in western part of the world, wrong monetary policies in the western part of the world is leading to resources flowing from the developing world to the developed world, rather than resources flowing from the developed world to the developing world. That needs to be altered totally.
It actually brings me to the question that I wanted to ask you. He's just lobbed it. But essentially, the obstacle in climate action being the flow of finance. And I have some figures here. Only 14% of total climate finance in Africa has come from private capital. And in India, international private capital accounts for less than 7% of climate finance. And the rest of it, more than 85%, is from domestic sources. So how do we mobilize private capital from the global north to, for the global south?
I would say from wherever. And let me start where you started as well with 100 billion, because I worked a little bit on that on behalf of the former UK climate presidency prior to Glasgow. They asked me to deliver the 100 billion delivery plan together with Jonathan Wilkinson, the minister from Canada. And I agreed to write this report, but under one condition, because Jonathan and I were both coming from the global north. And I said, whatever it takes, I will only write the truth. If anybody wants to push me to draw the picture nicer than it is, I will withdraw. And we came out with 80 billion that were delivered until 2020 or something around that. So that's not nothing, but it's not the 100 billion. And I think the key issue is here, and then I'm coming to the private sector. We all know that the 100 billion per year were not sufficient in the past, and they will never be. So by fact, whether it's 80 billion or 100 billion, is not so much the relevance. The relevance is about credibility. That's the currency we are talking about. And a group of countries, the old industrialized countries, promised back in Copenhagen to deliver 100 billion, and they did not. That's it. And we need to build up a world of trust, and that was violating trust. But now, as I said, on the requirements we have to transform this world to climate neutrality and to overall sustainability, because it's not only about climate, and I liked the introductory remarks. If at a point in time we would meet all our climate targets, but would violate the rest of the SDGs, we would have failed. We cannot pick just one target, as important as it ever might be. Now I think we all need to see that budget financing will not make it alone. It's impossible. It's completely impossible. But so we need the private money that is sitting around and waiting for investment. It's there in the global north, but it's also in many countries of the former so-called global south. And there are some key issues. Number one is investors want to have a secure environment where they are investing in. So, for example, wherever we have war or the absence of peace, investors will not come in. So working for peace as one of the key pillars of the United Nations is a key requirement. Secondly, we need to have the best possible absence of corruption. Entrepreneurs will not go into corrupt environments. They will not do it. Thirdly, we need to unblock all the obstacles we have on different sides. Now I'm speaking about the typical old donor sides. We are not using sufficiently instruments to de-risk investments. And we should do more about it, for example, using more guarantees, using more instruments like first losses that would allow enterprises to invest in environments that are more risky than elsewhere, but that are still appropriate for their financing. My last point is we need to have we need to go back to fact basis in information. There are so many fakes around, and just one example. We are also, Germany is leading the Sahel Alliance. My minister is president of the Sahel Alliance. And the investment risks in some parts of Mauritania, of course, are different from Mali. So you cannot look at it as one size fits all. It's differently. So we need to go back to serious fact-based information, and that is the basis also for serious decision-making in enterprises.
Just a follow-up. You mentioned how, peace and corruption are important aspects of this, but those are longer-term objectives. In the near term, what can we do to mobilize the finance?
Yeah, I think one step we did is already, let's look at the IFI sides, international finance institutions. We need to enter into reforms. And we kicked that debate off last year. Svenja Schulze as my minister and governor at the World Bank together with the US and others. And luckily we got the support also from partners as India. So that's an important step. That's a World Bank moves to a transformative bank in a holistic way, also with a new mission. Also to make better use out of the capital stock. I mean, we all insist that this bank is a AAA bank. But sometimes I say with a smile in my face, we don't need a quadruple A bank. So doing the right risk adjustment will allow to lend more money. But this will not be the end of the debate. And although we are not here in a private room, it's my conviction, although it is not shared everywhere in my constituency, that without structural reforms, we will not make it. It's a key requirement. If you listen to President Ruto at the Paris summit, he puts it so eloquently that they feel treated unfairly. And as long as this is sitting in the room, we need to work on it. And then we can talk about what would it mean if you change the voting rights in the bank. What would it mean in geopolitics, also with a big neighbor not far from here? But these are not sufficient answers on that. We need to work on it. My last point is I think what we immediately can do is to look how we can better use the existing financing, and that addresses also the regulatory framework. My constant example is as soon as you allow in many countries the non-discriminatory access to the grid, solar installations and wind parks will come, because in many parts of the world there are business cases, but only if you as an investor know that you can sell fairly, non-discriminatory, your produced electricity to the grid. So just a few examples. It's working on the institutions, it's working on the supply of financing, but it's also about adjusting it that the money can do the best.
With the learnings that you've had with the past year of steering G20, if you were to put together an action-oriented plan, and I'm saying action-oriented, very conscious of the fact that that is one of your favorite terms to use, and you've always steered us towards that direction also in Think 20. What would it be if we look at prioritizing inclusive development in the global south? And also, how can countries like India and Germany take this forward?
So on climate, you just need to do three things to my mind. One is go all out and achieve tripling of renewable energy, which is what has been arrived at by consensus in G20. And that means a lot of hard work by 2030. Tripling of renewable energy is a lot of hard work for every single country. So that's one clear target. Secondly is, even if you triple renewable energy, that's only 20% of your energy. The balance 80% is all hard to abate sectors. That's refinery, steel, cement, fertilizer, long distance transport. All those sectors need to be decarbonized. And that means that you have to move away from fossil fuel to cleaner forms of fuel, which is green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is important. And what you're seeing in the world today is a lot of protectionism. So the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIP Act of United States are the most protectionist pieces of literature ever written in the history of mankind. So if you start doing protectionism, you'll never get global size and scale. So you need to do that. And thirdly, to my mind, just 3 action points. Thirdly is, if you want to achieve net zero by 2050, the developed world, which has occupied almost 90% of the carbon space in the world, needs to advance its net zero target to 2040. These are 3 things which we must work on.
Thank you. Very neatly summarized, as always. So my last question to you is that you were recently in the UAE, where, of course, COP28 will be hosted, and you do work on COP28. How can we align the outcomes of India's G20 presidency with COP28 agenda such that they are aligned and not working in silos, and also while prioritizing the needs of the global south?
I can immediately continue what you have said. It's right, with the 90% covered by the industrialized world, if you include China to it. Because they are now the biggest emitter, and they will be the biggest in historic terms in a few years, 2-3 years. So the old divide has to be adjusted. It's a different world we are sitting in, which does not take any responsibility from our shoulders, not to be misunderstood. I think at COP28, we have all the chances to get an agreement. UAE is very committed. Sultan Al Jaber, the incoming president, he was treated with some suspicion because he's coming out of the oil sector, but he's ambitious. He wants to get a deal, and I'm sure he will manage to be a perfect president. And one key is focusing, as has been said, on the pillars that had been developed under the G20, tripling renewables by 2030, doubling energy efficiency. That's a way forward. Then, of course, we have to look at the issue of adaptation. It was too long underestimated in its relevance for those countries affected by climate change, specifically those who have the least means to adapt themselves. And certainly we have to find a solution for the loss and damage fund. We are ready to make a deal, and as I said, we need to look at the world as it is nowadays, and what we refuse to accept, we will accept a lot, but what we refuse to accept is that the biggest emitters puts itself in shoes of Ethiopia or other developing countries. That's not true. That's not fair. They are part of the disaster, and so they have to be part of the solution. That's the requirement we have, and of course we want to help those who are most affected, the most vulnerable countries, the SIDS, some of the African countries, to get prior access, preferred eligibility to the new fund, not excluding that there might be situations. Look at the situation in Pakistan, where the disaster was so big that everybody said, also of course, we have to help them. So it's not, we are not as strict, but there needs to be a focus. And then we have a preference for the World Bank as a host, but we are not strict, we are not missionaries on that, we are pragmatic, as I said earlier.
If I can quickly ask you to take that on as well, as we pass the baton from G20 to COP28, how do you think we can take this forward?
So I think, climate change is the biggest crisis before us. The Earth may survive, we'll all go extinct. And therefore, there has to be a huge sense of urgency. And that huge sense of urgency must come in from G7 countries. And in terms of pushing for greater reforms of financing, there must be a technological leapfrogging, because if you're talking about tripling of renewable energy, it requires resources. If you're talking about moving into hard to abate sectors, it requires a huge amount of technological disruption. Without that, it will not happen. And therefore, technological disruption will have to play a very critical role, to my mind. And I think more than anything else, and I entirely agree that if you're talking about 1.5 degrees centigrade at 2050, it will not happen. It will not happen without the developed countries taking leadership and saying that we are going to deliver it by 2040, including China. And these are, to my mind, the loss and damage also will have to be finalized in. But the roadmap for all this has been clearly laid out in terms of the finances required, etc., tripling of renewable energy. The roadmap for all that has already been laid out in G20, and therefore it will be far more easier for COP28 to push the pedal and accelerate the pace of implementation.
Thank you. This conversation was both reflective and also very action-oriented, and also the perfect start to 2 days of the Energy Transition Dialogues. Thank you for listening to us, and a big round of applause for our speakers.